Many countries in Fallout besides the US have been mentioned, whether that was pre-war or post-war. Now don't skip this part and head to your favorite country just yet. I need to let you know some important details about this video so you understand the premise a little better. In this video, I'm going to show you all the references or mentions to any other country outside of the US. Some of these are as small as name drops from an item in one random game. Some go all the way up to the Chinese remnants that are still existing today. Not all countries are mentioned, and most of the information we do have is pre-war and mostly just name drops. But it's still interesting to hear the part that some of these countries played in the Great War. Post-war information is few and far between, but it does exist and it is precious. Also, we're only showing what's canon to the lore. If it's non-canon, we'll let you know. Anyways, because of all of this, I'll leave a mentioned only or referenced only tag by each of the country's titles that doesn't have any solid information or lore, just the mentions. That way, if you're looking for deeper information on countries, you can skip to those. As far as the United States goes, we have a video on the channel breaking down every single state. So go watch that one after this one. Consider subbing because we have a lot more content just like this one on the way. Enjoy. Australia existed as both a country and continent before the Great War. Like most of the world, it didn't make it out unscathed. Whatever happened, it was hit just as hard. While we don't know a ton about post-war Australia, there are a few small references to it across the Fallout series. In Fallout 76, the Pioneer Scouts Camp's entomologist badge exam brings up something called the four-legged Australian termite beetle. Another exam, the one for mammalogists, points out that Australia is home to marsupials, and that red foxes weren't originally part of the ecosystem there. And in the Fallout TV series, the Australian flag shows up in the episode of Vault Seller's survival guide called Step on the Gas. So while it hasn't been mentioned a lot, and specifically post-war, Australia's definitely been name dropped here and there. My personal hope is that it's Mad Max style there. It just has to be. We only have a small piece of information on Austria. It only really gets a mention in Fallout Tactics, where it's tied to a pre-war weapon, the Steyr assault rifle. According to the in-game description, the Steyr was invented in Austria and stood out for its unique design and visual style. It was basically considered a solid choice for any soldier's loadout back in the day. And that's about it for Austria and Fallout. Just a brief nod through a weapon's origin, but it is good to know that they were still known for fine weapons even in the Fallout universe. The Bahamas. In Fallout 4, we find out that Vivian Odell, who managed the Boston branch of Hubris Comics, took a trip there in October 2077, right before the bombs dropped. And in the Fallout TV series, there's a poster for Nassau, which is the capital, hanging in Chet's kitchen in Vault 33. That same poster shows up in the episodes The Ghouls and The Past. The Bahamas gets a couple of subtle shoutouts. Belgium still gets a few shoutouts in Fallout Tactics. Two pre-war weapons, the Browning high-power pistol and the M249 saw, both trace their roots back to Belgium. The Browning was originally made there, and the M249 saw was a Belgian-designed light machine gun that saw widespread use in the late 20th century. There's also a weird bit of trivia involving Mr. House, specifically that of H&H Tools. He apparently had an irrational hatred for Flemish people and would fire any employee who even talked to one. The terminal entry is talking about the security systems and how House wants it to run. I won't read all of it, but I'll give you the little snippet that talks about the Flemish. Also, the Flemish thing is confusing to me. I tried to kind of figure out what it means, but the main reason Flemish has a separate name is that it's Dutch that is spoken outside the Netherlands, in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium called Vlaanderen, or Flanders, aka Flemish. Basically, all people from Belgium are Belgians, but not all Belgians are Flemish, I think. Anyways, enough of that. Here's the entry. Any employee seen to be cohabitating, colluding, or cogitating with any of the following groups will be terminated immediately: foreigners, masons, carpenters, tragic players, illegal aliens, extraterrestrials, or the Flemish. Like, holy shit. Who knew Mr. House was like this? Kind of blew my mind reading this terminal entry. Everyone knows that this will be a good-sized one. You could argue that we should have put it in our states video. Before the Great War, Canada was its own country, but things didn't stay that way for long. By June 3rd, 2072, it had been officially annexed by the United States. To Americans, it became known as Little America or the Big 51, mostly because of its rich natural resources, especially timber and oil. The US started leaning on Canada way back in 2059 when they built the Anchorage front line to protect Alaska's resources from China. Since some of the pipeline ran through Canada, American troops started showing up for security. But after China invaded Alaska in 2066, the US presence in Canada ramped up big time. That led to riots, protests, and rising tensions, especially as American forces weren't just guarding the pipeline. They were stripping the country for all it had. By 2069, huge swaths of forests were wiped out, and Canada was basically being treated as US property. Things boiled over in 2072. After a failed attempt to sabotage the pipeline and a wave of unrest, the US used the chaos as an excuse to fully annex Canada. Commander Buzz Babcock said it was all about the security and claimed that Little America had always belonged to the US anyway. By the time 2077 rolled around, Canada as a nation was gone. The American military was running the show, and Canadian provinces were just US territories, which were under military control but not officially states. Resistance movements sprang up and the US cracked down hard. People were arrested, shot on sight, and even executed on camera. American propaganda painted Canadian partisans like the Yukon 5 as villains in comics and cartoons, those like Armor Ace and Power Patrol. Vault-Tec jumped on the opportunity too, advertising vaults in the newly annexed Canada. Not everyone in the US military was on board. Some thought the annexation was flat out wrong. Open fighting broke out, especially in the Yukon, which became another front in the resource wars alongside Alaska. Still, the US pushed forward, pushing out media that made it look like a heroic liberation while demonizing Canadian fighters. Even after the bombs dropped, some Canadians moved south into former US territory, some looking for better opportunities, others following trade routes from places like New California. We know this because in Fallout 2, the Chosen One is having a conversation with a woman named Marge LaBarge. They ask Marge if they're a Redding native, and Marge responds by saying, "Heck no. I was born way up north, right on the edge of a lake." Lake LaBarge it was. Lake LaBarge is of course in Canada. So we know that this lady was able to travel through post-war Canada clear to California. Canada also pops up in a bunch of different ways throughout the Fallout games, even if it's just in the background or as a side reference. For starters, when Danielle Faye's stolen car was recovered, a Canadian flag was found inside. In Fallout New Vegas, Cass cracks a joke about Jean-Baptiste Cutting's name, saying it sounds Canadian. Canada also shows up on the terminal of a fed-up soldier named Jackie, though it's once again just a passing mention. At the Pioneer Scout camp in Fallout 76, there's a test where Canada is one of the wrong answers to the question, which country built the first major railway system? And if you poke around Sunset Sarsarilla's headquarters, you'll find a poster showing sales data including figures for Canada. In Fallout 3, there's even a 5% chance you'll find a letter in a mailbox addressed to someone who didn't make it into a vault. That letter lists newly annexed Canada as a possible resettlement option. In Fallout 76's Locked and Loaded update, Canada gets another nod. One of the villains, the Quebec Claw, is part of the Yukon 5, which was that group that was meant to villainize Canadian resistant fighters. And Fallout Tactics has a whole set of weird random encounters tied to Canada. One is called the Canadian Invasion Recreationists, where a character named Clarice tells a group to stand on the American side of the line, then walk to the Canadian side, and then celebrate by getting drunk. She also insists there's strong historical evidence that Canadian soldiers wore pink for some reason. Another encounter features a group who's flat out hostile, yelling Canadian scum and claiming Canada started the Great War. If you fight them, they shout out things like, "We invaded your country once and we'll do it again." One final Tactics encounter shows two Canadian resistance groups, the CPF and the PFC. They're arguing over what Canada's future should be. Both groups fly flags with different versions of the maple leaf. And in concept art for Project V13, which was a cancelled Fallout game, Vancouver shows up in the background with ads for its SkyTrain and C-Bus systems. But obviously this is non-canon. And also everything from Tactics can be considered iffy on canon-wise, so just keep that in mind. Lastly, Canada was actually planned as a full location in Fallout Extreme, which was an action game that never saw the light of day. Hopefully I got the majority of references for Canada. The cool part is that we got a little information of post-war Canada, but I definitely think it could be a cool place to visit in a game or a DLC. Plus, Bethesda can't use the excuse that it's not in the US, because in the Fallout universe, it is. Also, I'm not completely ignorant to the timing of all this and the real world. Sorry if it's a sensitive topic. I just want to preface this real quick by saying some of these names and stuff I might get wrong, so don't crucify me in the comments. But buckle up, because this is a big one, and right after Canada, which is kind of crazy. Before the bombs fell, China, which was known officially as the People's Republic of China, was one of the biggest global powers and the main rival of the United States. Founded in 1949 by Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, It grew into a totalitarian socialist state that stuck to the Maoist ideology all the way into the 21st century. Its capital was Beijing, and its military power came from the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Intelligence Ministry. By the time the fallout timeline really diverged, China had become one of the last remaining superpowers alongside the US and what was left of the Soviet Union. But while China expanded by annexing nearby countries to stay afloat, it couldn't escape the global energy crisis. As fossil fuels dried up, China struggled to keep up with the demand, especially once the Middle East oil fields ran dry in 2060, triggering massive instability worldwide. China leaned heavily on oil, uranium, and other natural resources. And when those started running low, things spiraled fast. The tipping point came in 2066, when trade talks with the US collapsed over oil. China had discovered a deep-sea reserve of petroleum under the Pacific, but suspected sabotage, likely American, kept them from tapping into it. At the same time, the US made a big show of debuting its first working fusion power cell, which only made things worse for China. Desperate for resources and with few options left, Chairman Chiang launched a full-scale invasion of Alaska. The plan was simple: take the oil by force. This kicked off the Sino-American War, and the battle for Anchorage became the focal point of the conflict. China poured troops into the region, hoping to establish a land bridge or at least a strong enough hold to pressure the US. But they ran into the first wave of American power armor, which stopped their advances cold. The war turned into a trench warfare, brutal, drawn out, and with no real movement on either side. It dragged on for over a decade. While all of this was going on, the US used the situation to pressure Canada into letting its military pass through, which, as we know, that eventually led to the US annexing Canada. Meanwhile, China ramped up its espionage and sabotage within the US, planting agents across North America to disrupt military operations and gather intel. Some of those operatives included characters like these, many of whom show up in different Fallout games. At the same time, the US stoked paranoia at home, launching another Red Scare. The government pushed anti-communist propaganda hard and even encouraged citizens to rat out neighbors for anything suspicious. They set up the Vigilant Citizens Hotline for this exact purpose. China didn't just rely on military strength either. It also turned to biological warfare. In response, the US gave Westtech a contract to develop a universal cure, which that eventually led to the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or the FEV. So while the war over resources was front and center, it was also a breeding ground for the kind of experiments that would define the wasteland later on. Despite heavy losses, resource shortages, and crumbling infrastructure, China never gave in. By the time the Great War hit in 2077, the country had officially ceased to exist. But its legacy lingered. The Chinese military was still feared, their tech was still advanced, and their operatives like Captain Zhao and General Jingwei remained active in some form long after the bombs fell. In Fallout, China is referenced across multiple titles, including Fallout 3, New Vegas, Fallout 4, 76, Tactics, Shelter, and Operation Anchorage. In fact, the entire Anchorage simulation in Operation Anchorage is built around the US pushing Chinese forces out of Alaska. And just to poke fun at how much is lost after the war, Fallout 3's Moira Brown even has a terminal entry wondering if China was ever real at all. It says, "What happened to China? Reports uncertain. China may be fictional." Even though the US claimed it was just defending itself, things escalated in 2074 when American troops actually invaded mainland China. Infantry and mechanized divisions were deployed across the region, but despite their strength, the US ran into serious problems. The war had already been going on for years across multiple fronts: Alaska, Canada, and now China. And America's economy was stretched thin. Supply lines couldn't keep up, and troops got bogged down trying to push through Chinese defenses. By 2076, the war had been dragging on for over a decade. Both sides were exhausted with no end in sight. That changed when the US rolled out the T-51 power armor in June of that year. It fixed all of the problems the older models had. And once American mechanized units were equipped with the T-51B suits, that tide started to turn. These armored troops tore through Chinese forces in both Alaska and mainland China, giving the US a much needed upper hand. On the Chinese side, things were falling apart fast. Their economy collapsed under the strain, and support from nearby countries they had annexed started drying up. The US wasn't in great shape either. By August, there were food and energy riots breaking out in major American cities. Martial law was declared and US troops were deployed domestically to deal with the unrest. Then came 2077. On January 10th, the Battle of Anchorage ended with a solid American win. Chinese forces pulled back and the US regained control of the area. With Alaska secured and Chinese supply lines in ruins, the US started shifting its military focus entirely toward crushing the last of China's resistance. The T-51B armor gave American forces a massive edge in this final push. Realizing how fragile the situation was, US leadership started prepping for the worst. Key figures and elite personnel went underground into shelters, just in case nuclear retaliation was on the table. Military bases across the country sealed themselves off, while active troops stayed deployed to keep the offensive going. Barely. At that point, both countries were hanging on by a thread. The war had gone on too long, and when the Great War finally came, it ended everything in an instant. It all came crashing down on October 23, 2077. In just 2 hours, the world as everyone knew it was wiped out. The US and China, once global superpowers, were reduced to ash in a massive nuclear exchange. Cities vanished in firestorms, sirens wailed one last time, and the vault sealed shut for good. According to what was left of the American government, China had been knocked back to the Stone Age, though there wasn't much of America left either. But not everything Chinese disappeared in the blast. In fact, some of what survived did so right in the heart of what used to be the US. Take Appalachia, for example. After the bombs dropped, Chinese PLA agents from the Fujinaya intelligence base scattered into the surrounding population. Some ended their lives on the spot. Others, especially the more hardcore loyalists, kept fighting their secret war long after the world had already ended. A few even became ghouls, still clinging on to that mission decades later. For some, the war was seen as the ultimate proof that America's imperialist ambitions had failed. Survivors like Agent Mo Shao didn't just disappear. They kept operating, hunting down defectors and anyone that they thought had turned their back on the cause, even 25 years after the bombs had fell. Some remnants managed to last even longer. As late as the 23rd century, Chinese holdouts were still alive in places like a fortified safe house hidden in the ruins of Washington, D.C. Over in San Francisco, survivors from a beached Chinese submarine joined forces with the locals after the war. That group eventually evolved into the Shi, one of the most technologically advanced factions in New California. They weren't just surviving, they were rebuilding. Most wastelanders, though, don't bump into ancient Chinese agents. What they do find are the leftovers of that war, Chinese weapons and gear scattered across the wasteland. Things like Type 93 assault rifles, Type 17 pistols, officer swords, encrypted radios, and training manuals from Chinese special ops. Some of it comes from infiltration efforts. Other pieces were just war trophies brought home by US soldiers before the world ended. China's military might before the Great War was built on sheer numbers and firepower. The People's Liberation Army leaned on its industrial strength and massive manpower reserves, but it didn't match the US when it came to personal protection. Chinese troops were typically issued basic jumpsuits, not heavy armor, but they made up for that with firepower. Their standard weapon, the Type 93 assault rifle, packed a much harder punch than the American R91. Tanks were central to China's strategy, especially during the invasion of Alaska. But once the US brought out early power armor, Chinese forces did find themselves at a disadvantage. With no real equivalent, they rushed to develop their own powered armored tech. Since they couldn't catch up in time, they shifted focus to something else: stealth. China heavily invested in stealth technology, and it paid off. They developed the stealth suits, which let their operatives slip behind enemy lines with ease. These suits were so effective that by 2075, China was rumored to have built an entire fleet of stealth submarines, nicknamed the Ghost Fleet. They didn't stop there. Chinese intelligence was a serious business. Covert networks of spies were set up all over the US, especially around Washington, D.C. They even maintained stealth patrols via submarines. Their operations were quiet but far-reaching. And while they struggled to produce power armor that could match America's, their stealth research outpaced everyone else. US efforts to keep up mostly relied on reverse engineering Chinese tech. Big Mountain had developed early stealth suits based on captured gear, and companies like Robco tried to replicate the stealth field modulation. That eventually led to inventions like the Stealth Boy, portable cloaking devices that didn't require full-body suits. Later, the Enclave would salvage a pre-war stealth upgrade from the Project Intelligence base in Appalachia, which they used to create the Stealth Boy Mark III. In Fallout Tactics, China is credited with designing the MEC Gauss minigun, an insane weapon that fires 2mm EC rounds at over 90,000 rounds per minute. It's wild stuff, but again, it might not be part of the mainline canon. Post-war, we don't know much about China the country, but we do have the remnants of the Chinese soldiers, weapons, and armor lying around. Mama Dolce's factory in the capital wasteland was a Chinese spy front before the bombs fell, and now when you visit it, there's still Chinese soldiers turned ghouls running the place. The Yangsha 31 is a Chinese stealth submarine from the Yangsha class. It was part of the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy and ran on nuclear power. Commanding the vessel was Captain Zhao, who we eventually meet in Fallout 4. Right before the Great War kicked off, the Yangsha was out on deployment, carrying a serious payload. 6 strategic nuclear warheads, along with an unknown number of smaller tactical nukes and torpedoes. When the order came down, Zhao followed through. He launched nearly all the strategic missiles, and only one failed to fire. Not long after launching its payload, the sub hit a mine. The explosion tore into its reactor, causing a leak and disabling the sub. With no way to move and radiation flooding the interior, the Yangsha 31 drifted into Boston Harbor, where it stayed. Most of the crew either died from radiation exposure or became feral ghouls. Captain Zhao survived and became a regular ghoul, becoming the last living remnant of his crew. You can actually help fix the ship, and Zhao will supposedly leave back to his homeland. The truth is, we could go on and on about China, and maybe we did. It is by far the biggest lore dump country in the entire game, but I think we covered the majority of it, and it's probably going to take up half this video. The Congo was a country in Africa before the Great War. It doesn't play a major role in the series, but it does give us a few scattered mentions across different games. One of the more well-known references is in the classic song Civilization, which plays on Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3. It also plays in Diamond City Radio Fallout 4 and Appalachia Radio Fallout 76. The song includes a lyrical mention of the Congo. Obviously, I can't play the song because of copyright stuff, but there it is. In Far Harbor, there's a display plaque in Vault 118 claiming that Ezra Parker saved a Congolese tribe. As a thank you, the tribe supposedly gave him a collection of pygmy skulls. Problem is, the whole story's nonsense. There are no tigers in Africa, and the pygmy skulls on display are just plastic props. The plaque is basically another example of Parker being a fraud and a con man. There's also a brief mention of the Congo in Fallout 76 when it shows up in a love note. Bet you never thought that there'd be so many mentions of the Congo in Fallout. Czechia doesn't appear directly in any Fallout game, but it does get a few mentions in Fallout Tactics and a subtle nod in the Fallout TV series. One of the clearer references is the Cellier and Bellow ammo found in the Vault 33's armory. These 9mm rounds were produced by a real-world Czech company, and the box even features the Czech coat of arms, a crowned double-tailed silver lion. That same ammo box shows up in the Fallout TV show, suggesting that Czech-made weapons and gear were still being used around the time the bombs fell. In Fallout Tactics, there's another connection. The Bren gun, which was originally a Czech design before being adapted by the British. The game acknowledges this in the weapon's description. Also, you have the modern Czech coat of arms in the TV show, instead of one tied to the communist era Czechoslovakia, which implies that the dissolution of Czechoslovakia, which happened in our timeline in 1993, still happened at some point before the bombs dropped in the Fallout universe. That's pretty interesting. Egypt was a pre-war country in Africa, and like in real world, it was known for its ancient history and iconic landmarks like the pyramids of Giza and the Nile River. In the Fallout universe, Egypt shows up in references across Fallout 2, 4, 76, and the TV show. Agatha's radio plays compositions from Egypt's classical legacy. And quiz questions in the Pioneer Scouts exams cover Egyptian topics like scarab beetles and papyrus. The renewal religion uses the Ankh, an ancient Egyptian symbol, as its logo. Even pre-war Hollywood got in on the Egyptian craze, with a film called Empire on the Nile, referenced in Fallout 76. And according to a Vault Cellar Survival Guide episode, the pyramids still stood long enough to show up in pre-war promotional media. I wish we had more than some of these references on Egypt, but this is where we're at. Ethiopia shows up briefly in Fallout 76. Specifically through a mention on Appalachia Radio. The reference comes during the Wastelanders update when the song In a Shanty in Old Shanty Town plays. After the track finishes, the radio host Julie chimes in and casually drops a bit of trivia. And that's the extent of Ethiopia's presence in the series for now. Like much of the European Commonwealth, France was hit hard by global resource crisis in the years leading up to the Great War. By 2060, the oil fields in the Middle East had dried up, and France, along with its neighbors, were left scrambling for what little remained. The Commonwealth eventually fractured into independent states locked in conflict, and what became of France after the bombs dropped is still unknown.
And the European Commonwealth would dissolve into quarreling, bickering nation-states, bent on controlling the last remaining resources on Earth.
There are hundreds of references to France in Fallout, but none that really explain anything that happened post-war. I'll give you a few just because that's what we're doing in this video, but just know that there's a lot more out there and it's all pretty minor stuff. This perk from New Vegas uses a well-known French saying, and in Dead Money, Dean Domino mentions having performed in Paris. French language and culture are found in several characters as well. Curie in Fallout 4 speaks with a French accent and uses various French expressions.
Why can't you just leave?
I require verbal or written authorization. Actually, any Vault-Tec employee, even you, could authorize me.
Andre Michaud, who appears in Far Harbor, also speaks French while he's wounded. Fallout 76 includes even more references, like a Miss Nanny using French during a story, and a Liberty Bell replica is noted as having been cast in France. There's also a bunch of other small references that are pretty unimportant for the most part. And that's about it. So we don't know a lot about France, but its culture still seems to be leaking into the wasteland 200 years later. After the divergence, Germany struggled through resource shortages and political fallout. By 2060, the European Commonwealth had basically collapsed, and Germany was caught in a conflict with neighboring countries over dwindling resources. Regardless, German technology still made its way across the globe. A bunch of energy weapons that survived the Great War were originally designed by German engineers and can still be found in post-apocalyptic US. In Fallout and Fallout 2, several weapons like the PPK-12 Gauss pistol, the M72 Gauss rifle, and the Vindicator minigun are noted as German-made. Many of them were developed by the arms manufacturer Heckler & Koch, including the G11 series, the MP9, and the Kaws shotgun. These games also show images of historic German sites like Berlin and the Ludendorff Bridge during their intros, tying Germany to the larger narrative of global conflict before the bombs dropped. Fallout 3 includes Stanislaus Braun, the overseer of Vault 112. He was originally from Germany.
Do you realize what you've done? You've triggered the failsafe, ruined everything. The subjects will die and I'll be stuck here in this hell alone.
You ruined everything! Everything!
You'll also hear music from German composers like Bach. They show up on GNR and Agatha's Station. In Fallout 4, the game's classical radio features more German composers like Brahms and Wagner. Nuka World also throws in a nod to Dusseldorf, mentioned in Wixon's Shovel Museum. Fallout 76 expands this even more with Helvetia, a town celebrating German heritage through a festival. The town features German food, music, signs, and even a painting with a German saying. And then you have characters like Hugo Stoltz, who's the Vault 63 overseer. He clearly comes from German-speaking backgrounds. Germany even shows up in Fallout Tactics and Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, mostly through references like Volkswagen and Heckler & Koch weapons. I tagged it as mostly mentions because most of it is mentions, but knowing that German engineers were making energy weapons that made it to the US is a cool fact. Fallout makes a bunch of subtle and not so subtle references to ancient Greece through names and dialogue. The Archimedes system and Euclid's Sea Finder are both tied to legendary Greek mathematicians, and the names actually reflect what the tech does. Characters like Macready and Ingram joke about the Trojan horse or Greek-sounding tech, and Fallout 76 even has an audio tour that name drops Poseidon, which connects to Poseidon Energy. Of course, the Pioneer Scout exams throw in trivia about Greek inventions like the ballista and historic events like the Greek Dark Ages. Sophia also references the myth of Arachne and Athena during one of her side stories. Greek mythology shows up all over the place, especially in names for items, robots, and factions. You'll see references to gods like Hades, Zeus, and Hermes, and mythical creatures like the Gorgon and Centaurs. Of course, there's also Underworld and the three-headed guard dog Cerberus, who's just a Mr. Handy. Lots of stuff about Greek mythology or Greece is everywhere, but nothing about it after the bombs fell, or before for that matter, because of course not. Greenland shows up a couple times in the Fallout series, but only in passing. It's described as a large island off the northeast coast of Canada. In Fallout 4, Deacon from the Railroad casually mentions that he once spent a few months sailing across the ocean and even made it as far as Greenland. He doesn't go into detail, he just says it was a wild story and promises to tell us more later. And then he never does, the bastard. Plus, he's always lying anyways, so who knows. Greenland also shows up visually in Fallout 3. It can be seen on one of the world maps used in a loading screen. But again, there's no deeper lore or location tied to it. India doesn't have a huge spotlight in the Fallout series. In Fallout 2, there's a terminal on the Enclave oil rig that notes it's playing an Indian movie, though the character using it complains that the film is boring. Meanwhile, in New Vegas, there's a patch on a boomer flight suit that represents the China-Burma-India theater from World War II. Then you have some references from the Fallout 76 scout badges like we talked about before, and the Fallout TV show that shows a flag.
Stay the fuck out of me business, don't go where you don't belong, and buy your drinks here. That's all you need to know.
Ireland was part of the European Commonwealth before the bombs fell, and it's mentioned fairly often. Before the Great War, Ireland had a close connection to the US, thanks to generations of Irish immigrants settling mostly along the East Coast. This influence is especially noticeable in Fallout's version of Boston, where Irish American culture still exists in everything from landmarks to organized crime. Fallout doesn't clearly explain what happened to Ireland after the war, but there's a strong hint in Fallout 3. Colin Moriarty, the saloon owner in Megaton, was born in post-war Ireland. That suggests some form of civilization survived there, even if the details are left vague. Irish heritage and culture continue to show up in various ways across the games. Fallout 4 leans heavily into this with areas like Irish Pride Industries and the Shamrock Tap House, as well as characters like Kate, who speaks with a thick Irish accent. Eddie Winter's holotapes mention the Irish mob and even reference trips to Ireland. There are whiskey bottles labeled in Gaelic, the Luck bobblehead decked out in clovers, and Old Longfellow in Far Harbor sings Irish folk tunes. It's not much, but between the cultural references and characters like Moriarty, it's fair to assume that Ireland might be damaged but not destroyed. It still exists in some form post-nuclear world.
Now, get the fuck out of my face.
Italy's impact on Fallout's world mostly comes from its people, culture, and crime families that made their way to the US before the bombs dropped. Two siblings, Quintino and Concerta Lombardi, immigrated from a small village near Naples and went on to establish the Lombardi crime family in Atlantic City. Some pieces of Italian history survived the bombs too. One example is the Soil Stradivarius, which is a rare violin made by Antonio Stradivari in the 1700s. It was preserved inside Vault 92, and it may be one of the last of its kind. In Fallout 4, Eddie Winters references dealings with the Italian mob. There are also mentions of Italian culture like the Statue of David and Sicilian espresso machines. In Fallout 76, you'll come across Italian-themed diners and archaeology exam questions that reference Pompeii and Sicily. One character, Giuseppe, is an Italian immigrant who still feels a strong connection to his homeland, and he wonders what became of it after the war, which is probably the only mention of what happened to Italy after the war by a character. And like him, we're also wondering. I imagine Italy post-war as like the old world mafia Italy. That would be awesome. Japan's influence stretches back centuries in Fallout's alternate history. One of the weirdest examples is Toshiro Kago, a samurai from the late 1500s who was abducted by aliens and put in cryosleep aboard Mothership Zeta. He wakes up in Fallout 3's Mothership Zeta DLC, still searching for his sword. In terms of modern history, Japan was involved in World War II just like in real life. The Fallout universe references the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US building the Sierra Army Depot as a defense measure, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with Little Boy and Fat Man. These events show up in the in-game museums and dialogue, mostly in Fallout 4's Museum of Freedom. After the bombs fell, Japanese culture didn't just disappear. In Fallout 2, descendants of the Yakuza, which are the Japanese mafia, still roam near New Reno. They're fighting other gangs and wielding traditional weapons. Food culture also survived. Margaret Primrose in Fallout 3 finds an old sushi cookbook and tries to recreate recipes with Mirelurk meat. Weapons like the katana and throwing stars have made their way back into the post-war hands, and you'll occasionally run into references to Japanese tech. One example is the Takahashi, the Protectron noodle vendor in Diamond City. He only says this.
Friggin' hole.
Do yourself a favor and just say yes. It's all he understands.
What are you saying? Yes?
But Curie can recognize it and respond to him in Japanese, so maybe his programming might still include more than he lets on. There are also several characters throughout the games with Japanese names or backgrounds. The Nakano family in Far Harbor, Paladin Sato from the Brotherhood, Grandma Junko, and a few residents of Appalachia also have Japanese names. And of course, there's Toshiro Kago, who's probably the most direct tie to Japan's historical presence in the entire series. Fallout also mirrors some real-world history through its alternate timeline. The internment of Chinese Americans during the Sino-American War is a nod to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. In Fallout, it was done through Executive Order 99066, clearly referencing the real-life Executive Order 9066. It seems to me that Japan in the Fallout timeline is the most affected country divergently, which makes it pretty interesting. In the years leading up to 2077, Mexico was hit hard by both natural disasters and outside pressure, especially from the US. A major earthquake struck Mexico City in 2042, and the widespread damage helped boost sales of Mr. Handy robots for cleanup. But by 2051, things got worse. The United States, citing political instability and environmental concerns, put economic pressure on Mexico to gain more control over its oil. that eventually led to US military occupation of key areas like the Chincotepec oil fields, especially in Veracruz, Hidalgo, and Puebla. Companies like Poseidon Energy used subsidiaries like PetroChico to operate these fields, branding it as a friendly partnership, but it was really just corporate exploitation. Mexican media wasn't totally silent though. A tabloid-style magazine ran stories on US elites, including rumors about Robert House. So even with all the chaos, people were still keeping tabs on what was happening north of the border. During the Great War, Mexico City was heavily bombed and reduced to ruins, though it might not have been hit as badly as some major US targets. What followed though was total societal collapse. Looters took over the capital and gradually turned into early raider gangs. Survivors tried to flee the destruction. Some made it into the US, reaching places like Zion Canyon in Utah or even New Vegas. The country's environment took a massive hit as well. Radiation and chemical waste from American facilities, including waste drifting down from the control station enclave in California, contaminated Mexico's coastlines. Beaches were wrecked, sea life was mutated, and new wildlife like bighorners or night stalkers became common by 2280s. By the 23rd century, the new California Republic expanded into Baja California. It didn't go well. Several characters in Fallout have Mexican ancestry, or at least connections to Mexico. Raul Tejada and his sister Rafaela are originally from Mexico and fled after the bombs dropped. Raul's backstory in New Vegas gives a detailed look at what post-war Mexico was like: radioactive ruins, early raider gangs, and life as a scavenger. It sounds fairly similar to more of the worst places hit in the US, places like the Pit or the Divide. Not fun. Others like Big Jesus Mordino or Lil Jesus Mordino and Rudy Fernandez also trace back to Mexican origins. Mexico is one of the few places where we actually get some information post-war. It makes it super unique to all the other places, and I hope in the future we start to get more information like this. Post-war, Mongolia's influence shows up more through raider gangs inspired by its history. The Khans and New Khans factions came out of Vault 15 and took inspiration from the Mongol Empire. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, they've evolved into the Great Khans, and their whole thing is rooted in the Mongol-style tribal structure. One character even mentions finding a book called Pretty Pretty Horsies, a history of the Mongol Empire, which is what helped shape their entire identity. The idea for the Khans was loosely inspired by a real-life biker gang called the Mongols. Fallout devs wanted to create a tough, nomadic group that felt like it could survive in the harsh world of the wasteland. Mongolia was also planned to appear in the cancelled Fallout Extreme, where it would have been home to a raider faction called the Huns. It's tough to put Mongolia as a mention only because the Khans are so relevant, but we have no information on the country pre or post-war, so there you have it. The wreck of the FMS Northern Star in Fallout 4 has a strong connection to Norway, mainly through the language spoken by the raiders on board. These raiders who have become ghouls don't speak English like most enemies in the game. Instead, they shout phrases in Norwegian when encountered, such as even when they're killed, the others might shout other phrases being sad about it, or when dying they might say this. This means I'm coming home. At least from what I could find, it's either a mention to Norway specifically, or maybe something like the afterlife. This consistent use of Norwegian implies that the ship and its crew were likely from Norway prior to the Great War. But even though they speak this, the ship's terminals are written entirely in English. This is never explained and might simply be just a gameplay convenience. But it does stand out given the crew's Norwegian background. Also, some of the Norwegian subtitles in the game contain errors or just weird phrasing. Just know it's not perfect, and the people who speak the language pointed that out to me in a different video. That's all we have on Norway, but it's pretty cool to see the people from the actual country in the game. According to Lorenzo Cabot's journal, he once traveled to Salalah, which is a city in Oman. It's a really small reference, but I had to bring it up. In Fallout 3, there's a location called the Meresti Metro Station. According to Justin, one of the characters there, the station was named after a town in Romania. He says Vance told him it was way across the ocean, in a place called Romania. And of course it's mentioned in 76 during that scout exam as well. Is every damn country mentioned in that damn thing? The Soviet Union, also known as the USSR, was still around before the Great War, but by 2077, it wasn't the major threat it once was. China had pretty much taken over that role in the eyes of the US. Even though the USSR was still viewed as a rival, relations had gotten a bit more stable compared to the Cold War era. The Soviet Union first came to be after the 1917 revolution. Later, the Soviets and China both pushed back against the US claim that Captain Carl Bell was the first human in space, because Fallout's version of history rewrites some major space race milestones. As tensions shifted, China became the bigger concern for the US, especially leading up to that Sino-American War. Still, the US lumped China and the USSR together as a communist threat. Analysts even consider a joint first strike from both countries as a real possibility. The Soviets also did human mutation experiments, which supposedly influenced some of the US military's more questionable research projects. Despite the political attention, there were signs of cooperation by 2077. A Soviet diplomat was living in Vault 13 during the war, meaning they were trusted enough to survive the bombs. Soviet weapons like the AK-112 were imported and ended up all over post-war California. The Soviet Union is referenced across the series: Fallout, Fallout 3, New Vegas, Fallout 4, 76, Tactics, and even the Fallout TV show. You also catch various in-world references: Soviet-style propaganda, posters mocking communism, old Russian vodka brands like Surkov in Fallout 4 and 76, and a Catch the Commie board game poking fun at Cold War paranoia. Behind the scenes, Fallout's creators originally steered away from using the USSR as the US's main enemy. They felt it didn't feel like a serious global threat anymore and leaned into China instead. That decision was partly based on personal experience. One developer recalled a moment in Moscow involving the Russian mob and gunfire during a call, which helped him realize how much of the Soviet Union had changed by the modern era. At one point, there were even plans for a Soviet spy subplot in Fallout 76's Wild Appalachia update. It would have involved the Soviet Mr. Handy and a secret training program called Mission Accessible, but that was scrapped before release. Spain had a long history as a global empire, driven by conquest and the search for gold, something Ron Perlman even points out in the Fallout intro when he says,
Spain built an empire from its lust for gold and territory.
Pre-war, Spain was still a known and visited place. Dean Domino from Dead Money references getting caught up in a mess in Madrid, and says it might have been even worse than what he went through at the Sierra Madre. There's also some small references throughout the games of places in Spain and things like that, but nothing I really thought needed to be on the list. I did think it was pretty cool that we had some small info on Spain pre-war. If you've watched this far, then you know that that's pretty rare. In Fallout 3, Three Dog makes a joke about a vault possibly leading to Switzerland, which means that whole idea of Swiss neutrality seems to have stuck around in the post-apocalyptic world. There's also a few other mentions scattered around the games. The P220 Sig Sauer is described as a Swiss-designed pistol. There's also a simulation set in the Swiss Alps in the Tranquility Lane files. By the time the Predictive Analytic Machine, or PAM, came online in 2067, the Taiwan Strait was going through some serious instability. This was triggered by something called the Pascal Incident. Using early version of PAM's code, analysts were able to predict the best moves to calm the situation down, and surprisingly, those predictions actually worked. While that's not the only direct mention of Taiwan in the main games, there's a little more found in Fallout 76's concept art. Some early designs for communist power armor featured Chinese writing that said, "Taiwan must be liberated." That fits with the pre-war Fallout universe, where the People's Republic of China was aggressively expanding its influence, which is cool because I'm glad we got a little piece of info on this country. The one time Tanzania pops up is in Fallout 76, specifically in the Wild Appalachia update. Can you guess where? During the Pioneer Scout Tadpole Badge exams. I bet you never saw that coming, and that's literally it. Türkiye is only brought up a few times across the Fallout series. In Far Harbor, there's a spot called the Aldersea Day Spa, and one of its big features was offering a traditional Turkish spa experience. There's also a couple of ancient references tied to the region. Pioneer Scout Badge exam mentions Troy and Wilusa, both cities from ancient Türkiye, as part of their quiz material. The flag even makes a quick appearance in that Vault Seller's Survival Guide episode. And I know, I hate to keep bringing up the scouts in the TV episode, but if that's what we got, then that's what we got.
Say there's a newcomer around here who doesn't understand that I'm a bartender, not a damn news bot.
While you never actually visit the United Kingdom in any of the games, it comes up a lot through character dialogue, robot catchphrases, and various bits of background world building. We don't get much detail about what life in the UK was like leading up to 2077, but there are a few clues. Mr. Handy robots sometimes blurt out lines like "for Queen and Country," which implies that the monarchy was probably still intact. Characters like Whitechapel Charlie and Johnny Weston also reference England, showing that it was still populated and active well into the 21st century. What happened to the UK after the bombs fell is unclear, but Fallout 3 does give us a little hint. Alistair Tenpenny, the man behind Tenpenny Tower, was born somewhere in the British Isles. and then he had made his way to the capital Wasteland sometime in the early 2200s. That suggests parts of the UK might have survived or were at least still inhabited long after the war. Mentions of the UK are scattered throughout the series. In Fallout 3, robots and museum displays reference Britain's involvement in the Revolutionary War. There's even a Protectron who rants about King George III. The Point Lookout DLC also has a cathedral named the Ark and Dove, which were real English settler ships. Fallout 4 introduces Whitechapel Charlie, who's a British-themed Mr. Handy who runs a bar. The Freedom Trail tour in Boston gives more nods to British troops from the 1770s. And there's more, so on and so forth, all just smaller minor details. Fallout Tactics includes characters like Sharon, whose family is from Essex. And they also had Martin, who comes from a line that ran a UK-based software company. Emil Pagliarulo, who worked on Fallout 3, said characters like Tenpenny were included to remind players that other parts of the world still exist. Josh Sawyer also mentioned an early idea for a game set during the Resource Wars that would have involved British soldiers, but that concept never moved forward. In Far Harbor, you can find a placard in Vault 118 that talks about the Cardoza Medical Research Center, which was located in Venezuela. According to the plaque, Ezra Parker, one of the Vault's residents, was the one who funded and managed the project's construction. In Fallout 76, during the Pioneer Scouts Hunter Badge exam, Vietnam is referenced a couple times, and Vietnam also shows up in Fallout Tactics. The game's intro references the Vietnam War while describing the US military's history, though it leans more into real-world context than Fallout-specific lore, and that's it. I know some of the mentions and references aren't super compelling stuff, but I hope you enjoyed them all the same. I think it's still important to include stuff like this into lore videos even if it's not flashy. We have a lot more content on the way that you don't want to miss, so consider subbing, and if you left us a like, we'd really appreciate it. Remember guys, enjoyed time is never wasted time, and we'll see you in the next.